We're going to complete the account of Jesus' crucifixion. Matthew 27 from verse 33. And when they came to a place called Golgotha, which means place of a skull, they gave him wine to drink mixed with gall, and after tasting it, he did not want to drink. And when they had crucified him, they divided up his garments among themselves by casting lots. And sitting down, they began to keep watch over him there. And above his head they put up the charge against him, which read, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." At that time 2 robbers were crucified with him, one on the right and one on the left. And those passing by were blaspheming him, shaking their heads and saying, "You who are going to destroy the temple or the sanctuary and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself. If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross." In the same way, the chief priests also, along with the scribes and elders, were mocking him and saying, "He saved others. He cannot save himself. He is the King of Israel. Let him come now down from the cross, and we will believe in him. He trusts in God. Let God rescue him now if he delights in him. For he said, 'I am the Son of God.'" And the robbers who had been crucified with him were also insulting him with the same words. Now from the 6th hour, darkness fell upon all the land until the 9th hour. And about the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, saying, "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani?" That is, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Some of those who were standing there, when they heard it, began saying, "This man is calling for Elijah." And immediately one of them ran, and taking a sponge, he filled it with sour wine and put it on a reed and gave him a drink. But the rest of them were saying, "Let us see whether Elijah will come save him." And Jesus cried out again with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit. And behold, the veil of the sanctuary was torn in two from top to bottom, and the earth shook, and the rocks were split, and the tombs were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. And coming out of the tombs after his resurrection, they entered the holy city and appeared to many. Now the centurion and those who were with him, keeping guard over Jesus, when they saw the earthquake and the things that were happening, became very frightened and said, "Truly this was God's Son." Well, good morning. We've just read this account of the most famous execution in history, the execution of Jesus of Nazareth, who we call Christ. I'd like to consider the question today, why did Jesus have to die? In a sense, that's a very ordinary question to ask. It's a question we would naturally ask if we knew someone who was being put to death. Well, what did they do? What action could possibly justify such a punishment? At the same time, if you believe in God and you find out someone you care about is dying, you're left with a big question. Why would you let this happen, God? Why didn't you save them from this fate? And actually, the question is a lot more potent than that, because God knows the future and God is all-powerful. So the question is, why would you choose death for this person? Jesus' friends and followers would have been asking the question, why did you choose death for Jesus, God? Jesus' death seemed even more impactful to them because it seemed so sudden. In the space of just a few hours, Jesus went, as we have just heard, Jesus went from having a meal with some of his closest friends to hanging on a Roman cross and breathing his last breath. Now, we have to understand that in reality, it wasn't sudden. Jesus told his followers with great specificity what was going to happen to him here at Golgotha. Matthew 16 tells us that Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and on the third day be raised to life. What did the disciples do in response? They denied it. We're told in Matthew 16, verse 22, that Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. "Never, Lord," he said, "this shall never happen to you." Jesus' followers didn't conceptualize, they couldn't understand how that could be God's plan. But it was God's plan. So why did God choose death? Let's pick through our passage again. Let's go through that again. Why did Jesus have to die? Why did the people in charge, why did the Jewish leaders, why did the Roman authorities, the Roman governor who sentenced him, why did they choose to have Jesus killed? And why did God choose for it to happen? Let's start with verse 33. When they came to a place called Golgotha, which means place of a skull, they gave Jesus wine to drink mixed with gall, and after tasting it, he did not want to drink. So as we've heard this morning, Jesus has already been sentenced to death by the Roman governor, Pilate. Pilate didn't believe that Jesus deserved death, but he decided to have him executed anyway to appease the people. So Jesus has been beaten and mocked by Roman soldiers, and now he's taken to Golgotha, which is Calvary in Latin, the place of the skull, which is an appropriate name for an execution site. And when you were executed by the Romans, when you were crucified and hung on a cross, you were crucified naked, and therefore we read from verse 35, when they crucified him, they divided up his garments among themselves by casting lots. And sitting down, they began to keep watch over him there. They cast lots for his clothes. Now, in a sense, that seems just sort of a matter of course. It just, this person is being put to death. He doesn't have his clothes anymore. He doesn't need them anymore. So let's just take them, we'll divide them, we'll throw the dice and see who gets what. An observant Jew, though, would have seen something a little different here. The thought of casting lots for clothes harkens back to the song from the Old Testament, particularly Psalm 22 tells us about a king of Israel who trusts in God, but who's beaten, who's mocked by his enemies, and who says in verse 18 of Psalm 22, "They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots." Jesus' death is echoing the words of this psalm. And what's the charge of which Jesus is convicted? We see in Matthew 27, verse 37, above his head they put up the charge against him, which read, This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." And that answers our first question. Why did the Jewish authorities want Jesus dead? Why were they so insistent that the Romans who ruled over Israel would have him killed? Because he claimed to be, and because many people thought he was, the rightful king of the Jewish people. Clearly, the Romans don't take this idea very seriously. They didn't feel threatened by Jesus. They didn't see that he was a rebel or that he was any threat to them, which is why they had to be sort of dragged into killing him. But to a Jewish leader, what did it mean for a so-called king of the Jews to come along? First, it meant that your own position was threatened. Because if you're just sort of a regular politician, say a member of parliament, a judge, this guy comes along claiming to be a king, and you haven't had a king for hundreds of years, that could be a real threat to your position, to your social status in that society. Particularly if this so-called king was very popular, which Jesus was. But even more than that, the claim to be the king of the Jews meant something even more to an ancient Jew. And because the Jews of the day weren't just expecting any old, okay? They weren't just expecting any old king to come along. They were expecting a king that had been spoken about, that had been prophesied about for hundreds of years, called the Messiah, the Christ. When we call Jesus Christ, that's essentially a different way of calling him King Jesus. And the Jewish population was expecting the Christ to come along, to kick out the Romans, to free Israel from their oppressors, to bring peace to Israel, to rule the people of God with justice. Many people thought that Jesus was the Christ, and so why did the Jewish authorities want Jesus dead? Because as the alleged Christ, he was a threat to their authority. In Jewish thinking, it was impossible for the Christ to be killed by the Romans. He was supposed to get rid of the Romans. He was supposed to deal with the Romans. So they thought. So for Jesus to hang on a cross, which was this symbol of brutality, this horrible torture and execution device, and this sign of Roman oppression, this would have put to death the notion that he was the rightful king of the Jews. So they mock him. Verse 38, at that time 2 robbers were crucified with him, one on the right and one on the left. And those passing by were blaspheming him, shaking their heads and saying, "You who are going to destroy the sanctuary and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself. If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross." In the same way, the chief priests also, along with the scribes and elders, were mocking him and saying, "He saved others, he cannot save himself. He is the King of Israel. Let him now come down from the cross and we will believe in him." As far as they knew, the Christ couldn't be killed by the Romans. So this mockery stands. Jesus is disgraced. Why did Jesus have to die? From the perspective of his opponents, even in the worldview of his closest friends and family, this was proof that he was a fake and a fraud. It was a demonstration that Jesus was not the Christ. So the crucifixion therefore suggests at a higher level that God had rejected Jesus. That's the religious significance for a Jewish people. So it seems little surprise when verse 45, darkness fell upon all the land until the 9th hour, which is 3 o'clock. And about the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice saying, "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani," that is, my God, why did you abandon me?" Verse 47, and some of those who were standing there, when they heard it, began saying, "This man is calling for Elijah." You know, it's as if Jesus crying out Eli, which in Hebrew is Eliah. He couldn't quite say the full word. That's what they seem to be hearing. And immediately one of them ran, and taking a sponge, he filled it with sour wine and put it on a reed and gave him a drink. But the rest of them were saying, "Let us see whether Elijah will come to save him." There was a Jewish tradition at the time that the Old Testament prophet Elijah, in a true Jew, in the hour of need of a real man of God, Elijah would come and save them. And so they're sort of applying this as a test. If God is really on the side of Jesus, then Elijah will come and save him. According to their test, he wasn't. Verse 50, Jesus cried out again with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit. Jesus died. The self-proclaimed King of Israel, the hope of Israel, died an accursed and tortuous death, unthinkable, unfathomable, ashamed, disgraced, naked. Why did Jesus have to die? Well, we've got to think back to Matthew 16. What did Jesus say about it then? Matthew 16, verse 21, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed, and on the third day be raised to life. So Jesus' death didn't just come out of nowhere. It wasn't a surprise to him, even though he claims to be this king everyone hoped for. For Jesus, being the Christ, was compatible with dying. This was the plan. Well, we might say maybe he just saw the writing on the wall. He was drawing a lot of attention to himself. He was making a lot of enemies. He saw the threat to his life and he concluded, oh, they're going to get me. That still wouldn't explain this prediction. Wouldn't explain the full extent of it. Think back to how the Roman soldiers treated Jesus, the mockery, the dividing of clothes, the echo of Psalm 22. How does Psalm 22 begin? It begins with Jesus' last words, which in Hebrew are Eli, Eli, lama azavtani. My God, why did you abandon me? In other words, Jesus' death was foretold hundreds of years before he was even born. Not only here in Psalm 22, but very famously, it was foretold by the prophet Isaiah in Isaiah 53, verse 10 says, "It was the Lord's will to crush him and to cause him to suffer." It was God's plan for Jesus to die even before Jesus was born. Why? A few verses earlier in Isaiah 53, verse 5, we're told that he was pierced for our transgressions, when the nails which pierced his hands were driven in, attaching him to the cross. They attached our transgressions and our wrongdoings along with him. He was crushed for our iniquities, Isaiah says. When someone's crucified, they have to expend all this effort just to push themselves up in order to breathe, in order to draw in breath, and they have to keep doing it until, due to sheer exhaustion, they're no longer able. It's as if they're crushed. They suffocate because they cannot breathe anymore. Isaiah prophesied that this would happen to Jesus in our place. In other words, this was meant to be us. The death penalty God chose for Jesus was our death penalty. The one assigned by God to me, to you, the one we were sentenced to. You might say, I'm not a murderer. I haven't broken any laws that would warrant that. Jesus tells us in Matthew 5 that to even insult someone is worthy of death. And that's not our society standard, because if society lives by that standard, you're not going to have a society for very long. But it's God's standard. To even insult someone, or Jesus says to be unduly angry at them, is deserving of judgment and is deserving of the death penalty that Jesus received. If God is just, then that's what's coming our way. And this is the bad news for us. God is just. But there's also good news. God is love. And so God sent his Son, Jesus. In fact, we're told in the Bible that Jesus is God himself, God the Son, who became a human and lived the perfect life that we were supposed to live. And even despite that, he received the death that we were supposed to die. He received our death penalty. He died the death we deserved. So, why did Jesus have to die? Jesus didn't have to die. He chose to die so that we could be saved from that death. And as he was dying for their sins, the Jewish leaders, the people of God, mocked him. He saved others, he cannot save himself. He is the King of Israel. Let him come down now from the cross and we will believe in him. This is the option open to us. We can join in the mockery if we want. You have that option. And Jesus' sacrifice will be of no use. Or you can make the choice the mockers refused. You can choose to believe in Jesus. You can choose to put your trust in Jesus. And he will save you. He has saved you. The moment you give him your trust from a righteous and terrible judgment. Because he took that judgment on himself on the cross. And he hasn't just saved you from your just desserts, he has saved you into a better life than you've ever known. You know, we're told that these other mockers came along and said to Jesus, "You who are going to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself." Jesus never said he would destroy the temple, but he did say he would rebuild it in 3 days. And we read about this in the Gospel of John. John 2, from verse 18, says, the Jews asked him, this is when he's in the temple, "What sign can you show us to prove your authority?" And Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple and I will raise it again in 3 days." They replied, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple and you are going to raise it in 3 days?" But the temple he had spoken of was his body. Because Jesus wasn't just a man. He was God with us on earth. God on earth. That's what a temple was in ancient thought. It was a place where a God lives on earth. And the Jerusalem temple was a place where God lived in the world. The place where human beings could be with God until Jesus came along. And then Jesus was where God dwelt with us on earth. Only through Jesus can we return to God like a lost child finds a mother. It's what it's like for us to be with God. Jesus was that temple. Jesus was God with us, which is why we read in Matthew 27, just as Jesus' body is broken, just as he gives up his spirit, verse 51, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and the earth shook and the rocks were split. And we see that Jesus' death meant new life for us. Verse 52, and the tombs were opened, and many bodies of the holy ones who had fallen asleep, who had died, were raised. Coming out of the tombs after his resurrection, they entered the holy city and appeared to many. Jesus died so those who trust in him can live. Verse 54. Now the Roman centurion, and look at this unusual but powerful example for us. This was not a man of God. This was an oppressor of God's people. The centurion and those who were with him keeping guard over Jesus, when they saw the earthquake and the things that were happening, they became very frightened and said, "Truly this was God's Son." Jesus was put to death by men who wanted to prove that he was not God's chosen king, but in doing so, they fulfilled these ancient prophecies. They revealed the exact opposite. Jesus is king. Jesus is Christ. Jesus died for our sins to save us from suffering and death. That's why God chose death. Because through the death of the one, the many can live. However, we still die, we still suffer, which is why the story is not yet over. The Gospel of Matthew doesn't end with chapter 27 and the Friday. It ends with chapter 28 and the Sunday. I hope to see you back here this Sunday to finish the story with us. Now we're going to share in communion in the Lord's Supper. If you're a member of God's family here today, please feel welcome to join in as we eat bread in remembrance of Jesus' body, which was broken on the cross in our place, and as we drink grape juice in remembrance of Jesus' blood, which was spilt for us, of the new life he has given to us, which we have received if we have put our trust in him. Please come forward and take the bread and the juice from the attendants at the front, and then we will eat and drink together.